So it's the 22nd of November today. It's probably time I start my wife's Christmas present.
Over the last year, my wife has fallen down the custom mechanical keyboard rabbit hole. So for Christmas this year, I'm going to build her a new keyboard to add to her collection.
I picked up some English walnut and I've roughly drawn out the shape I want the keyboard to be. It's going to have a built-in wrist rest. This rectangle here is where the keys are going to be. We should hopefully get some really nice grain in the wrist rest. The gap is going to be filled with some black epoxy. So this is the case that came with the kit that I've based the design off. This is going to make it a lot easier because I can take all these internal measurements just to make sure that all the components fit in without a problem. So before I build the form to pour the epoxy, I'm going to need to give these a bit of a plane because they're not that flat. Now these pieces are a bit too big to run through my benchtop surface planer, so I'm going to have to build a sled and put them through my thicknesser. So building a thicknessing sled is pretty simple. I can just reference off this flat surface, put my piece on, and I'll use these finish spreaders, so like a plastic material, and they've got this tapered edge, so they're quite good as little wedges. So I can sit that under that corner, and now that, if I position it right, is pretty flat to that surface. I can hot glue that into place and add this stop onto here. That will stop it getting pushed back when it goes through the thicknesser, and get this surface parallel with this surface. So now one side of each board is nice and level. We can just run them through the planer without the sled and get the other side parallel to it. I've marked everything out again. This is where the keyboard's going to be, this is going to be the wrist rest and the epoxy in the middle, and then these black lines around the edge. It's just where I'm going to cut it oversized to fit it in the melamine form for when we pour the epoxy.
This is just a nylon brush that I picked up a while ago, but it clips into the end of an impact driver or drill, and it's great for removing any dirt or leftover bark without losing the character of the live edge. Now the walnut's being rough cut and cleaned up, I can take those measurements and start cutting down the melamine to create the base for the form. I'm also cutting down some 40mm strips that I'm going to use for the walls of the form. The walnut pieces are only 25mm thick, so this gives me plenty of headroom in case I overpour the epoxy. I'm using parcel tape to create a barrier between the epoxy and the melamine. I'm not sure if this is going to work, but it's a hell of a lot cheaper than buying the tape that's designed for this purpose, and I'm sealing all the joints with some cheapy silicone that you can just pick up at any hardware store. I've measured in half the thickness of the wall pieces all the way around the outside of the base of the form, and I'm drilling some holes so I can put some screws in from underneath just to hold everything tight.
So the form is done. I've run a bead of silicone around all the inside corners just to minimise any chance of leaking. All the screws are on the bottom. I've probably put way too many in, but better safe than sorry. This is going to be curing inside my house as it's about 8 degrees out here at the moment, and that's just too cold to let the epoxy sit. So that's coming indoors when I pour it. That'll probably be tomorrow just to give the silicone a chance to cure. Anything I can do to reduce the risk of epoxy leaks inside my house, I'm going to do. So the silicone's cured for the form. I've got these pieces of walnut in there, and I've got these crocodile clamps just holding everything down so nothing floats up when I pour the epoxy in. I've also checked it with the spirit level, and it's level across both planes. So now it's time to mix the epoxy and get that poured. It's actually warmed up a lot since yesterday, so I'm going to be pouring out here. If it does get a bit colder, then I'll just take it inside.
The resin I'm using is from Epoxy and it's their Eco Plus 2-part resin. It can be poured up to 50mm deep, and for the 1.5 kilo kit I bought, I paid £25. I've used a volume calculator to work out how much resin I need to mix up, and I've added another 10% on just to be safe. Once I've weighed out both parts, I'll use mica powder to turn the resin black.
It's been just over a week since I poured the resin. It is fully cured now. I did have to top it up a little bit because it seeped under. Those crocodile clamps didn't really do the job that I wanted them to do, but it wasn't too bad. It was just one extra layer of epoxy on top. So now it's time to see if the cheap parcel tape did the job and I can unmold this.
It was at this point when I began the demoulding process that I was actually pretty shocked at how easy the form was coming away from the epoxy. I didn't expect this cheap tape to perform as well as it did, so going forward, anytime I need to make a form to pour epoxy, I'm going to use this tape to create the barrier between the epoxy and the melamine. I decided to go with the drum sander instead of the thickness planer to remove the excess epoxy. I'm not sure if it would have done any damage to the blades in my thickness planer, but I know the epoxy cures really hard and I didn't want to risk it. Anyone who has used or owned a drum sander knows that it does take quite a few passes and a lot of time to remove any excess material. So I've swapped out the 240 grit belt for a 120 grit belt just to help me speed up that process.
After going through the drum sander, we got rid of all the excess epoxy that was on top, and I've run it through on the back as well just to get everything parallel. So the next job is to mark out where the cavity is going to be for the circuit board, the plate and the keys to sit in. So I'm going to start measuring that up and marking that onto here.
The cavity I need to cut out is 306mm by 97mm. I'm creating a guide to run the router against by sticking down some melamine pieces with blue tape and hot glue, effectively making double-sided tape. This is going to make cleaning up a lot easier after I'm done routing, as I can simply peel the tape off instead of having to try and scrape the glue off the workpiece. Now I'm done with the first pass of the router, I don't need to keep the melamine guide there anymore, as I can use the cavity itself as my guide for the final pass. Here I'm just squaring off the rounded edges with the chisel. I can now use a table saw to cut the case down to its final size.
I've got the case cut down to final size. The next thing I want to do is put an angle on it, so as it's sitting on the desk, it's lower at the front than it is at the back. To do this, I'm going to make another sled, but this time I'm going to intentionally put it through at an angle so that it flattens the top surface, and then when I flip it back over, it will have that lean so it's lower at the front and higher at the back. Now I've got it all mounted down to the sled. You can see that this side's slightly higher than this side. Just the thickness of this spline, that should give me that angle that I want. I've also put a block on here just to stop it getting pushed back as it goes through the drum sander. And I've got some yellow pencil marks that I've just made here, and that will let me know when I need to stop sanding, as it will be a level plane all the way across.
Once I got the angle on the back to a place that I was happy with, I flipped the case over and continued running it through the drum sander just to get a bit more of an angle on the wrist rest. I've used a piece of blue tape as a guide to let me know when I need to stop sanding. Now I've got all the angles cut to where I want them, and I've got a nice chamfer to break all of the edges, including the sides here, just to give it a bit more of a geometric look. What I want to do next is get the circuit board in and mark out where the USB-C port is going to be, so I can drill a hole in the back here to get the cable in so that can be powered. I've marked where I need to drill with this cross here. And I've also picked up this aviator cable to connect the keyboard, specifically because it's got a rounded barrel. So what I can do is measure the diameter of the rounded barrel and use a drill bit slightly bigger to ensure that the cable will be able to plug into the keyboard without any issues. I was planning on using my drill press to drill this hole, but I didn't have enough space to fit the keyboard case vertically underneath it. So instead I secured my drill block with a couple of elastic bands and used a 12mm auger bit to make the hole. In order to connect all the components into the case, you screw them into these standoffs. Now this is the kit case, and I don't really want to pull the standoffs out of these in case I want to use this case again in the future. I bought a 320p standoff kit off Amazon. It was only about £9. So what I can do is take the smallest standoffs that came, drill some holes in the case that I'm making, and then just CA glue those into place and connect all the components and have everything held in securely. I decided to hand sand all of the edges as it's a lot easier to round them over when using a random orbit sander. It didn't take too long and I think it leaves them looking a bit cleaner. I will use a random orbit on the rest though to save time. All the sanding's complete now. I've gone up to 180 grit on all the faces and on the edges. The next step is to give it a wipe down with some white spirit to remove any of the dust left over from sanding before I finish with Rubio Monocoat. This is just white spirit and a cotton rag I picked up from a local hardware store. It's great at removing any leftover sanding dust, and I only need to wait about an hour for it to dry before I can apply finish. I'm going to mix up some of the Rubio Monocoat, which is 3 parts of part A and 1 part of part B. I'm only going to probably need about 20 millilitres of this, so I'll do 15 of A and 5 of B. This is my favourite finish to use on most projects. It is quite expensive, but it's really easy to apply and a little does go a long way. I start off by applying a small amount of Rubio to the workpiece and then spreading it out with a plastic spreader. I'll use a white pad on my random orbit sander to buff it in and then wipe up any excess with a cotton rag. I'll then repeat that process for the front of the case. Around 5 days later the finish is fully cured, so I can begin final assembly on the keyboard. I decided to go with Acco Cream Blue Pro tactile switches and a set of SA profile keycaps, as I think my wife will like this, but she always has the option to change these out if she wants to later. I had a lot of fun working on this project and I'm really happy with how it came out. If you enjoy videos like this, let me know by hitting the like and subscribe button, and I'll see you on the next one.